Breaking news! Justin Baldoni has just dropped some bombs! Hello, my friend. Perez Hilton here, the queen of all media, the original influencer. I've been doing this for 21 years and your number one source for everything. It ends with us. I previously shared with you that the New York Times recently filed a motion with Judge Lyman in New York City federal court to have themselves dismissed from Justin Baldoni's lawsuit. Yes, they were lumped together in the amended complaint. Well, literally moments ago, Baldoni's attorneys have filed a motion objecting to the New York Times' attempt to be dismissed from the lawsuit, and they've shared a lot of new information. Get ready. They came out swinging. Listen to this. A pietistic bastion of the media establishment, the New York Times. Pause. If you don't know what pietistic means, it describes something related to or characterized by pietism, a movement within Christianity emphasizing personal devotion, holiness, and spiritual experience over strict adherence to doctrine or ritual. A pietistic bastion of the media establishment, the New York Times has long presumed itself beyond accountability. Not here. The New York Times went past merely reporting on plaintiff Blake Lively's California Civil Rights Department complaint and actively vouched for the veracity of its false narrative. The fair report privilege the New York Times seeks to hide behind does not protect it from liability for maliciously colluding with Lively and her cohort to publish a fake and defamatory hit piece about the Wayfarer parties, wrongly casting them as villains and making them scapegoats for Lively's well-publicized media missteps. In his objection, Baldoni claims that Blakezilla and her publicist started working with the New York Times way back in 2024, around the time of the film's release, when she and her husband Ryan Reynolds demanded that he and his partners release that horrific statement they wrote, which was an apology for things he never did. The objection to dismiss says, quote, "The Wayfarer parties finally stood up to Lively and Reynolds and refused their final demand that the Wayfarer parties put out a false and humiliating statement admitting wrongdoing. In response to them refusing to release that statement and apology, Lively and Sloan worked with the New York Times to concoct a story that would blame Lively's downfall on the Wayfarer parties, relying heavily on deceptively spliced private text messages stolen from his publicist's phone by her former employer and Baldoni and Wayfarer's former publicist, Stephanie Jones of Jones Works, LLC. The objection continues, saying the New York Times coordinated its publication with Lively's filing of the otherwise confidential CRD complaint on December 20th, meaning the future lawyer and her team leaked the confidential complaint to the New York Times. And as a result of their leak, the New York Times ran their article, and the objection to dismiss says, quote, "As a direct result, the Wayfarer parties have suffered untold harm." The article from the New York Times states that during production of the film, Lively had complained that he and Baldoni had repeatedly violated physical boundaries and made sexual and other inappropriate comments to her. As admitted in the article, the New York Times relied not just on the CRD complaint itself for its reporting, but on thousands of pages of documents that the New York Times reviewed. How do they get that? The New York Times should be held accountable. they make this assertion. I'm keeping that in. I was thinking assertion, whatever. Bloopers just remind you all, I'm not as perfect as I come across. I'm such a dork. Also noteworthy, the objection makes a point to highlight not just the New York Times article, but the accompanying video from the New York Times as well, and how they view that as problematic also. Quote, the video and the article both state that the Wayfarer parties engaged in a smear campaign against Lively, with the video proclaiming it's impossible to know how much the Wayfarer parties planted and how much of it was originating organically. Whatever the case, they seized on it and amplified it. The New York Times published an article and video advancing a factually false and defamatory narrative about the Wayfarer parties based on deceptively spliced and cherry-picked text messages. Now, it must answer to them. Dun, dun, dun. And in a preemptive move, they are trying to paint the picture that claiming a smear campaign is opinion is no such thing. Because remember, I told you all that Blake Hurd's publicist is also trying to get herself dismissed from the lawsuit, claiming that when she told journalists that there was a smear campaign and the whole cast hated him, that was just her opinion. The objection to dismiss the New York Times says, quote, the statements at issue here were made not in an editorial or letter, but rather in an explosive, feature-length expose reported by, among others, the New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning star journalist, Megan Toney, based on their own review of thousands of pages of text messages and emails. The New York Times statements in the article and video are not couched or qualified by equivocal language suggesting that the New York Times or TOE were expressing an opinion. They were presented as statements of fact based on first-hand knowledge of the evidence. In the context, a reasonable viewer would have interpreted the New York Times smear machine and smear campaign statements not as mere hyperbole, but instead as provable, verifiable assertions of fact. Statements of this nature are not shielded from suit as non-actionable opinion. Can't argue with that, can you? I gotta tell y'all, after reading all of this, I've changed my mind. Initially, I thought the New York Times should not be lumped together with their lawsuit, but now I do. Or, as Baldoni's attorneys have previously said, if the judge is inclined to dismiss them, that they should be able to file a new complaint against the New York Times. That seems very, very reasonable to me, and they've made a very strong case for why the New York Times collaborated with her smear campaign, why they didn't do their due diligence, why they relied on heavily edited information, and to add insult to injury, they barely gave him any time to respond. I remember. You remember? I've read every piece of every document related to all of this. That is why I am your number one source for everything It Ends With Us saga. So, my fam, I ask of you, if you're Judge Lyman, how would you rule? Do you think the New York Times should be dismissed from this lawsuit? Yes or no? Thoughts on some of the new information we've learned in their objection? Let's get into it all in the comments section. I love you. I mean it. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for the support.